Good afternoon. I wanted to talk today about a kind of a topic that's been on my mind all this year. You know, I really have studied at a really academic level complexity theory for a long time. And if you read all these books, Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, Outliers, there's all these books that are really different subversions of complexity theory. And in fact, Nassim Taleb writes about complexity theory in economics and business in the guise of black swan and probability math, but it's really all kind of subdivisions of complexity theory, and I am fascinated with the topic. And so Scott Page is kind of one of my favorites, being from University of Michigan. He's a University of Michigan professor. But I wanted to talk about two aspects of complexity theory. I think people confuse complexity with complicated a lot of times. So I wanted to talk about those two attributes and how we use it in the businesses to achieve kind of great things. It's actually pretty amazing. So you can have this range of outcomes in the system, right? You can have a very stable system where nothing much is happening. It's very much it's a zero event system, right? So they use the example of a ball sitting in a bowl. If it just sits there and nothing acts on it, it will just stay there forever. Nothing very interesting happens. So kind of zero activity. All the way to all mangle of things happening, which is chaotic. That's also not very interesting because it all just mangles into a mess, right? There's no order or structure or interesting things happening. So complete chaos is actually not that interesting. Where it gets interesting is kind of in this middle. And I think that too many people make the mistake in their analyses. Think about politics, think about global interactions in political policy, economic interactions, which also is political policy. People view things as being mechanical. Mechanical things can be complicated, right? But mechanical things can never be complex. Complexity is a different thing. Now, everything on this scale has four elements that you kind of analyze to see what your outcomes are. It's right here. Diverse elements in the system, right? Different actors. The degree of their connectedness. So how much diversity, how much connectedness between those actors? Are they all acting independently and never connected? How much interdependency? In other words, how much does the action of one influence the action of another? How much does one person want to be like the other or want to not be like a different one? And then adaptation, that these people can adapt or these elements can adapt over time. So you imagine in a mechanical system, like a machine, like at granite mill, we have these big machines that process textiles, right, and coat these textiles. There is no complexity in a machine. It is false to use the term complexity when talking about a machine. They are purely mechanical. The difference is that they might have diverse parts. They might be connected kind of one step at a time. They don't adapt. None of those parts adapt, right? So it can be laid out in very mathematical terms. When you turn adaptation to zero and interdependency kind of to zero, the connectedness and diversity of parts just leads to a machine. So machines are very mechanical. The problem is most people approach the world from a mechanical, a mechanistic philosophy. So when you approach companies this way, you can be very process-oriented. Now, dogmatic process is bad, right? You can address diversity and connectedness through process. So in complex business models, we also want process, but we want them to be able to adapt and evolve. And that's what we focus on. So this is a machine, and this is an ecosystem. Ecosystems follow sets of rules. They have physics that apply, a process that's mathematical that applies, but different actors can make different choices within the system. That is a business, right? If you don't embrace the process of adaptation and interdependency, and you focus everything on diversity and connectedness, then you'll end up with a system that caps out. Typically what happens here is these baby boomers, I say baby boomers, all founders, it's just true of all founders, the sheer effort it takes, again, to get a company off the ground requires an intense focus on process and mathematical opportunities to fix outcomes. But once you get it to this point, it's limited. You can't really break out of that because there's only one of you. And you can't create all adaptable, interdependent relationships in your image. All of these things that can happen become too much for diversity and connectivity to keep contained. You can't do it. So what we do is we move from mechanical to complex to create growth. It happens every single time. In every single one of our portfolio companies, we've achieved 35% or greater increase in EBITDA within 18 months. It's actually fascinating. And when you engage in this process and reverse the org chart, top-down oppressive control versus bottom-up support and information flow to adapt and change systems, and you get a really robust employee base, it is fascinating to see that culture change and all the productivity that comes out of a much smaller group of people. So interesting though, all things relate to this. Think about global policy, whether to support the Kurds in Syria or not. Well, people address it like it's a mechanical outcome. The truth is it's more dynamic than that. So that's why when you change behavior, like our current president has done, you'll get some odd failures that people wouldn't have expected, and some interesting successes that they wouldn't have expected either. Because it's not just his behavior that matters, it's also the behavior of the other players in the system who adapt to his behavior, and their behavior then causes other people to adapt, and this interconnectedness, or this interdependency rather, and connectedness then influences a different global situation. So you have Bahrain joining this treaty with Israel versus a Syria-Kurd-Turkish battle, right? So interesting things happen. I think that people try to make it simpler than it really is. It's much more diverse. So when people talk about, oh, it's terrible what's happened with our international relations, maybe it's hard to tell because it's not as simple as a mechanical process. Somebody says something, does that automatically mean that 10 years from now the outcome will be worse? Probably not, and those things play out over decades. So it's interesting, even the Supreme Court nominee, the left would say bad things are going to happen immediately. The right, they think good things might happen immediately? Maybe. The truth is, probably neither of those happen. There's just too much complexity involved to make such mechanistic determinations about what will happen when you add one person to a system of 9 with laws that support that, and cases and statutes and a constitution. It's really much more complex than that. And it also relates to this interdependency, an interesting process of in-groups and out-groups. So think about who your in-group is. Who do you associate with? And as you stack identities, do you start to limit your other choices because you don't want to be associated with an out-group? Or do we start to out-group and in-group expand to include portions of those out-groups? Irish and Italians in the 30s were considered, 20s and 30s were considered part of the out-group, right? But eventually the out-group expands and these out-group adapt to be part of the in-group. So there's an interesting evolution in these things over time. Herbert Spencer, great evolutionary sociologist, talked about in-group, out-group evolutions over time. He just didn't use those terms, but really this is all part of complexity theory. Fascinating concept. Just want to give you a couple of elements on it and how we use that to really cause businesses to grow and evolve past their mechanistic limitations.